Hello everyone, today we talk about the Christianization of the Slavic lands and the Germanic push towards East. We made a video, I think, more than 1 year ago, actually it was 2018, one of those archaic early videos about the Ostsiedlung, right, so the settlement of largely German colonists and merchants and other and also military orders, as we know, in the East, not just in the Baltic actually, but various areas of Central Europe, Eastern Europe, even the Balkans, etc. And these are all very broad topics that, as you understand, can be framed also into different boxes. Like you want to talk about settlements and colonization during the Middle Ages, or specifically of the Germans, or do we have to talk about the Crusades, the Northern Crusades in this context, or the proper ecclesiastical history of the Christianization of the Slavic lands? So these are big topics that I realize we haven't quite discussed a lot, right? That video about the Ostsiedlung was actually about the creation of the Ordenstaat, right? So the Teutonic, probably the Teutonic state, because what this military order achieved in the Baltic was something incredibly advanced for those time standards, even for several reasons actually that partly we will explain today, but that can be chiefly reduced to the fact that it was a kind of, in fact, of a monastic order. It wasn't a feudal, like a seigneurial possession. It didn't go split, for example, generation after generation. It also was done by essentially wiping out largely what was in the middle, so that something more centralized could be built, right? And there are analogies, historically speaking, that basically the core land Frankish feudalism in Europe corresponds also to some of the most advanced areas in Europe at this time. We were talking about it yesterday, incidentally, talking about the spread of crossbow in that video, Western Frankish crossbowmen in the 10th and 11th century. And yet there was a problem of governability in these areas, because basically feudalism, albeit actually incredibly efficient as a gluing factor overall in terms of governance, was also irremediably decentralized, but especially there was and this is probably the most important aspect of the world, though, not much a problem of actual direct control, but the fact that dynastically speaking these territories went split, like including kind of entire kingdoms theoretically, at least in their territorial dimension, proper, not much of their institutional one, went split among male sons. And this was a great deal, right? It was one of the major factors why the Merovingian Empire failed, the Carolingian Empire failed, and it took so much before actual monarchies with a kind of statal profile could emerge. And in other areas where that feudalism hadn't existed, for example, you find the case of the Normans, right, that are fully Frankish in political culture, that conquer, for example, Anglo-Saxon England and Muslim Sicily, and these were lands where there was no feudalism, right? So they managed to wipe out, right, who was there largely. Okay, they kept certain administrative structures. Objectively, was also a lot of continuity with certain local things, but we shouldn't emphasize that excessively, in my opinion. And in these lands, for example, we have the Normans building what were actually the most centralized feudal kingdoms in Latin Germanic Europe, right? Because objectively, England, even more Sicily, were basically the single most centralized kingdoms ever, but still they were subject to feudalism and all these problems, etc. What happens in the East with the Teutonic Order is wholly different for the reason we have explained, and they managed to build an impressive structure that however also had its own problems, but that is not to be found much elsewhere, right? For example, the Kingdom of Jerusalem in the Near East, in Palestine, was initially on this path, and eventually it went downhill let's say, for also in their essentially feudal problem, but not only, right? There's also problem of resources, etc. Even though it had actually a massively strategic advantages, that this is totally overlooked when studying the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Actually, the immense advantages deriving from its geographical location, actually. Another proof yet that geopolitics does not exist, because in fact, those advantages were not eventually enough for making the kingdom survive. Remember always this: geopolitics, if you hear it somewhere speaking about, that doesn't know what they're talking about. Geopolitics does not exist by definition, right? Whoever does it, maybe let's leave it to, whatever. Let's not digress on this, because I start getting, evil. And however, so what happened in this, and this is a key of interpretation of the world, but as we've seen, it goes much beyond. I think another perspective that we should have when evaluating this expansion of what I see not much as actual German culture in itself, because it sounds a bit more kind of retro and also kind of equivocal in part. And in fact, the last time was a reproach because I titled that video like Drang nach Osten, right? That is the old 19th century historiographical term that is loaded with nationalistic stuff. Well, it's not a big deal. As a name in itself, Drang nach Osten, what's wrong about it? It doesn't say, Heil Hitler. It's simply saying a push towards the east, and that's it. And the fact that it was used prominently by even nationalist and even dictatorial historiographies doesn't mean that we should police the actual etymology of a word that is totally innocent, right? The Ostsiedlung also, it could be equivocal as much as associated with Lebensraum, for example, but here we don't care. And in fact, what I would like to stress in this context is that I see it mostly as an expansion of Frankish feudal models, right? And not only. Objectively, there was a character of the Eastern Frankish kingdom, aka what would become the kingdom of Germany, effectively at one point. In this process, certain environmental and political and social dynamics that favored the properly German, especially northern German expansion towards the east, and therefore the picture we should have is usually, especially when we frame this as a crusade. The other ideological perspective. This stuff is perceived like Christians butchering pagans, right? It was much more than that. Like, aside from the fact that everybody at the time wasn't quite nice with each other, and those who were massacred not necessarily were, they were not deserving that, maybe, but they weren't, or not necessarily at least, but they weren't, they were just the unlucky ones, or the less capable ones. They weren't necessarily the better ones, right? This is an interesting perspective we should always have, because, by the way, I'm making all of this premise because looking at the countries of the area, pretty messed up things happen, right? Not just at the time, but also up to the last century, right? In terms of genocides, deportations, restructuration, social engineering. I mean, this is not just about, Germany or Russia or what. The problem, basically every single state involved there did something that was a kind of ethnically, if not ethnic cleansing, but something, in some degree, fundamentally. And there is a lot of hatred still around between certain nationalities, and of course we hope for the better, that everything, of course, objectively today we live in a better condition. Those countries are, let's say, happier than ever in part, not all of them, but relatively to these issues particularly, but in general things are getting better. People are kind of coming together. We're starting to build a sounder historical awareness about what things were, but still certain topics are very, very hot for some, right? Every time you mention a certain nationality sometimes, but not only in this northeastern European context, but it could be with any other country, not just in Europe, everywhere. Everybody feels like, you're talking about my country and my identity. And I think, well, this is not a big deal, and it wasn't a big deal at the time. At the time, if you want to understand these worlds, you have first of all to acknowledge the dramatic political fragmentation that existed at the time. Nobody wants to deny certain even proto-national identities. That it's something we, especially for this early times, we should be kind of cautious speaking of. But if you look at the political and military history of this context, you realize that everybody did whatever the hell they want on the basis of the local lord, what was more convenient to do or more or less to do. And then the whole thing is, in fact, you can't speak of Germans versus Slavs, right? It doesn't damp. The same Teutonic order was technically a vassal of the Polish kingdom, and there were lots of Slavs participating to the push towards the east, actually as themselves getting Germanized in culture in terms for reasons of political co-optation, etc. And in fact, large areas of this formerly just kind of largely Slavic areas were, aside from the Baltic peoples, were Germanized, right? And it was a slow but consistent process, as you know, that left a mark that, in fact, the ethnic cleansing of the 20th century really didn't help too much to leave track of. But you can see, of course, even architecturally speaking, even in other, even genetically, certain things do not disappear; you can't wash them away. But another perspective that's very debated, and I think that when we talk about, in fact, Northern Crusades, sparks, the tension, etc., is in fact the Christian versus pagan dichotomy, which is objectively true. Like we don't want to minimize, but obviously it's not either an extreme or another. There are certain middle grounds that are important to focus on, and also a broader perspective, though, in this specific context that is somewhat a bit too localistically conceived. Like the historiographical attention of what happened there is like saying, these people arrived from the West. They started butchering everyone that didn't want to be subjected to them, independently even from belief, because there were peoples that had converted to Christianity for the sake of not being massacred. They were massacred anyway. This also happened. And as a proof that religion is an excuse, largely, historically speaking, and that, of course, there were deep religious motivations, and spirituality was deeply felt, but if you study the real political military practice, you realize that, the reasons are much more pragmatic, much more consistent anyway. Right? Another problem we have in this sense is that we study history seemingly for moralistic aims when we talk about this stuff. Like, who was the evil guy, who was the good guy? And people reason like this are kind of, I don't know what, and even how to define them. But it's like, first learn history, then judge it, because most of the times it's done the other way around. Right? History is taken as a empty shell that you can't fill with all the meanings you feel you have within you at 1,000 years of distance, and pretending that's historical reality. No, history doesn't work like that. History works like you studying like 60 years of your life on a single topic like this that you will not finish anyway because it's too vast, and then maybe you can start expressing some timid judgment about it. The rest is just rubbish. But the thing we should focus on mostly is on the comprehensive understanding of this world, in the sense that, going back to the Frankish and the Christian perspective, you see what the Frankish and Frankish Christian world was doing at that point. It was expanding objectively, right? We have talked a lot about this on Schwerpunkt, that Western Europe is not just growing like its neighboring regions, it's also expanding, which is a very different thing, right? It's the capacity, essentially, to form new bases that in turn can grow by themselves, and that are extremely resilient, right? There's behind the destruction, the annihilation of certain political and social realities, there's also the failure of a model, or at least the incapability of competing with the one that was rising at the point, and that is objectively the one from which most of our idea of Western world was emerging through, right? Because it is in fact what survived today, which is, especially when you study the Middle Ages, you start getting sensitive, of course, also about those who were left behind. Those cultures and communities that were in part wiped out or repressed or taken, put it at a second level, but that still contributed to our own identity and world, and still do, right? And need to be recognized in this sense as well. But when we think about the Northern Crusades, we generally escape the fact that they weren't particularly different conceptually, and in part factually too, from what was happening in the Near East and in the Iberian Peninsula. Right, the Crusades, the Reconquista, the Northern Crusade are part of a broader dynamic that you should better conceive as such, and then just descending gradually into the details, the specificities of the Baltic, the Baltic reality. There is another massively important perspective that is the religious one coupled with the temporal one. Here we're talking fundamentally about the expansion of Catholicism, right? And as we will see now, the Baltic Crusades, Northern Crusades, started very early, telling the truth. We somewhat get the impression that, they were the Crusades in the Near East, and then these came later. But objectively, they started more or less at the same time. And you can't even start to say, and because we're talking about crusades too, consider that expeditions, the wars that the Eastern Germanic kings had started against the Slavs is something that began from Carolingian times, passing through the Ottonian times, and there were actually massive things. There were wars with Bohemia, with Poland, etc., and there was all a development that naturally the Eastern Germanic kingdom, as such, as a political unity, as a unique polity, let's say, was relatively weak. Like Germany had a lot of strengths in its own, but as you know, it took. It was very difficult to make it take off. Like by the 12th century, objectively, the Holy Roman Empire meant this Germanic monarchy, by approximation, was objectively the strongest power in Western Europe. Yes, it was. But, as you know, the internal institutional balance of the kingdom was disastrous. That's the reason why the Germans actually expanded in Italy and in the Mediterranean and attempted to seize Constantinople. Constantinople was easily to fall into the German hands before it did into one of the French and the Venetians, just to tell it all. And it didn't happen, but it was a possibility, it was an option. There were certain crossroads in which, taking another direction, even just the outcome of a battle, might have shifted the balance importantly in this regard. Even dynastic problems, right? The Hohenstaufen were objectively quite unlucky by certain standards. But just for saying that this local push, especially in northeastern Germany, like Eastern Saxony especially, was very strong, right? These were areas, there is this latitudinal line you can draw in this context. That is to say that, of course, Southern Europe largely was kind of, let's say, Southern and Western Europe was more advanced than Northeastern Europe, and consistently, right, really consistently at this time. But especially in the centuries of the 11th to the 12th century, Northeastern Europe grew faster. Right. There were also because it partly was exposed to southwestern European influence. Paradoxically, even through the destruction of this Germanic element, let's say, coming from this Frankish background in Central Europe, that was ideally part, in fact, of the West at least. There's this axiom southwest northeast is not necessarily geographical. It's loosely geographical, but it's mostly in fact political and social, and how Frankish feudalism, essentially, and all what it entailed, expanded in. But the interesting thing here is that the schism, for example, between Rome and Constantinople was very recent. It happened at the end of the 11th century, and here, after essentially a decade or two, in the case of the Baltic direction, it was very, very close, of course, and it represented, therefore, an incredible surpassing, let's say, of the Orthodox world, broadly meant, in terms of, in fact, of expansive capabilities. In the previous centuries, during the 10th, the 9th, Roman Roman Christianity and let's say Greek Christianity, whatever you want to call it, fought over largely Central Europe. Like there was a struggle for Hungary, for Moravia, etc. There were certain, even for Bulgaria at one point, because these were areas that were still not Christianized, and the two churches battled, and not just them, but the empires that were supported by, in this sense, wrestled for putting this also polities that were forming as kingdoms, etc., under their own sphere of influence, right? And it was a very hard battle, struggle, in the sense that that would last also longer than it's commonly thought, because of course at the end of the day Hungary fell into the Western sphere. Poland more easily fell, at least in the Western sphere. Bulgaria remained fundamentally Orthodox. Russia, of course, but for example Lithuania, up to the 14th century, it was still undecided. Lithuania eventually, with the union with Poland, would fall into Catholicism, but objectively they were thinking up to the last second to switch to Moscow, to Russia and the Orthodox. So this, let's say, religious geography is quite important as well, to understand how actually the Western branch was an incredibly more dynamic system at this point, was capable of extending itself over enormous areas, right? In part facilitated by the fact that certain regions were still kind of weak, like they were primitive, they were poor and civilized, so they were more easily conquered, right? The Byzantines had troubles with kind of relatively greater problems. Of course, the Muslim principalities were very advanced at this point, and the world picture was not particularly easy, right? And generally speaking, politics at this time made progress very slowly. But this is exactly why, looking at what happened with the Crusades in general, whichever they were, like from Spain to the Baltic, well, there were objectively enormous achievements obtained by Frankish Catholicism in this regard. So the interesting thing also is how permeable this Catholic offensive was, because it was fighting, in fact, on all fronts. Even the Near East, the Crusades were essentially the Near East had been usually battleground with the Byzantines, right? The Byzantines at one point managed to retake Antioch. Even they were historically projected towards this world. A bunch of barons start this first crusade in 1096 in Belgium, and they arrive and they create, and that basically they reconquer all the coast from Antioch to almost to Egypt, in fact, and the Byzantines remain speechless. And this is a perspective that I started reevaluating a lot, like of this, not really the pseudo-humanity of this transformation that in fact we think of in these terms, because we don't see what had happened before. We tended historiographically in the West to overly emphasize what happened, especially in the 11th and 12th century, forgetting what was already happening before, like since the 8th, the 9th, the 10th century. That is actually pretty impressive in Western Europe. But at this point, this explosion of the West is overwhelming, right? And it has to be understood even in its violent affirmation. But these were wars, right? Okay, the casus belli might have been defensive. Here we're not talking about who started first, like, it's obvious that there was an interreligious fight at some point, but as we've seen also in the many videos I made on the Crusade playlist, that we tried to explain how religion, yes, was important, but it wasn't objectively like the first the decisive mover of this all. Like, there were lots of it might have been even the most important in relative terms, but in absolute terms it wasn't like it didn't even reach a half of the reason. Like, hence we can't even talk properly about wars of religion, especially in the Near East, when the objective was not converting people who were there. It was just defending the holy places, and then, given that there were holy places also for the Muslims and the Jews, for example, well, the whole thing is much more shaded, and we've made tons of videos showing how many Christians fought into Muslim armies and vice versa. Talking in terms of these dichotomies is easy because people are radically ideologized by the foe, by ignorance, by hatred, by incoherence, and incapacity of understanding complex realities. But we should make this effort here and not falling into a trap like, this only happened because they were fighting over a book. No, it wasn't like that. It wasn't absolutely like that. And any person who has at least an elementary knowledge of medieval history, I think, you don't even need to go to university to know these things. I mean, it was obviously not. Religion was obviously not of course not the sole factor, but definitely not even the decisive one, right? Because if just for example, Western Europe hadn't had the demographic and economic strength it had, this stuff probably would have not even happened. And there were other peoples around there that didn't do these things, right? And aside from the fact that religious motives, ever since religion ever existed, were always there. Like, what do you think, that medievals were a bunch of bigots, fanatics, because they were Christianized, and I don't know, in the ancient world the people fought for secular reasons. Ancient world was, in political and military terms, was based solely on religious motives, right? Even if formally, even in there, of course, religion was not the first reason why wars were fought, not the decisive one, but still every single people at the time fought for his own religion. All of them, from the first to the last. This stupid secular modernistic mindset for which we have to think of the Middle Ages as a time of oblivion of reason and dominated by spirituality. These are concepts that show exclusively the complete historical illiteracy of the people who make these statements. Because, especially if you like military history, and you come from a rational and anti-dogmatic background, you perfectly know how such conceptions are completely useless, because you can't study even a single campaign or battle in Crusaders' times without realizing that religion came second, basically, in every single circumstance. So it's somewhat difficult to talk about this stuff, because a lot of people get weird about hearing this. I don't know why. It's a problem with them. I frankly don't care about it. If I see a lot of haters, ideologies, and I simply block, and I don't have a great problem with that. And up to this time, nobody actually had much of saying about this topics. Like, there's never been someone who actually attacked me. People kind of listen to this seemingly understanding. So I'm pretty confident in expanding further on this on this level, but actually by not considering it, because this is the real problem. Like, considering obviously all the religious and spiritual factors that moved this stuff, but not putting at the center of attention like people paradigmatically do all the time. The fact, these guys were butchering others because they were ideologies. No, there were much other reasons, and humans have always been butchering each other on a regular basis, and we keep doing it all the time. Doesn't matter if there is religion, if there is not, if there is a certain political ideology or there is not. Or better, well, political ideologies do help, but also political ideologies are part of a broader reasons, right? If you understand the radical ignorance of countries where dictatorships exist, for example, at least in terms of the masses, you realize what we're talking about even in here, right? So there are entire disciplines that deal with and the debunking of certain cliches and in grand style, right? In the sense of, I don't know, a country did this just because of this ideology. Well, no, it never happens like that fundamentally. Those help, but there is all a background that we decide to eliminate just to isolate the thing that matters to us and ignoring all the rest. And that's a perfect recipe for not understanding anything about history. So it's Catholicism meant as the political and military guide of Roman Christian elites that increase in this time their own effort for the Christianization and colonization of the Slavic lands of northeastern Europe, right? It's an initiative that at the beginning of the 12th century was promptly started or revived actually by those ecclesiastical princes and lay and ecclesiastical princes of Eastern Saxony, right? This was an area that had always been heavily militarized because it was fairly poor compared to other areas of Germany. It was expanding, however, in its own regard. Even demographically speaking, it had a lot of strengths and forces that had to be invested where had to vent in a way or another, and much of the way this translated itself to was military expeditions against the bordering Slavs that objectively, especially in certain regions, were still organized in kind of a tribal base, right? We talk about Slavs, but we're actually other ethnicities in countries that even today are kind of almost fully Slav in a background that eventually time and even these military expeditions contributed to wipe out, in part to make us forget. And of course the Baltic peoples and their kind of debated ethnic origins, and that however weren't that dissimilar actually from the neighboring peoples, and they were, you know, fundamentally the same, right? Here the ethnic discriminant basically does not exist. It's not important fundamentally. There was a lot of cooptation, as we were saying before, even of Slavic elements into German elites, simply because there was no coercive power to arrive there and literally wipe out everyone, right? It was easier to deal with local elites and to start something. Objectively, the German pressure towards the east had also facilitated, because of metus hostilis, the enucleation of certain political entities like, I don't know, Bohemia, that, you know, was eventually integrated even into the Holy Roman Empire with a regal title, regal dignity as an institution within the empire. Poland as well, that technically actually helped the Germans, but the Slavs regularly participated. Like in Bohemian kings, you know, Königsberg was founded allegedly by Ottokar II. It was normal for even these Slavic kings and princes to go out there and to spend their journey into the Baltic Crusade. It was normal, right? Just like the French nobility did that with in the Near East. These guys did it there, and it was a great opportunity, right? It was a matter of self-promotion, of expansion of clienteles, of enrichment, of strengthening political ties, and the Germans, in fact, expanded into areas that were kind of weaker politically, more politically fragmented. I don't know. The Bohemians had fought against the Eastern Frankish kingdom. They even kept intervening into internal matters of the German kingdom. Poland, of course, had battled, like the Ottonians launched campaigns often, right? The Polish monarchy had a pretty tormented history. Like, it was very, it was very difficult to keep together all these Polish principalities. The Piasts were always kind of split. There was a brief history of Polish regal unity during the centuries, but they still existed as centers of powers on their own that were progressively absorbed. I don't know, think about Silesia and all the Germanization of the area that originally belonged to this Polish polities. And therefore, this was also a very progressive expansion, right? These peoples had seen, in fact, a continual warfare, right, since ever. Like, before, there had been the Saxons in there. They had been fighting against the Slavs. The Slavs allied themselves with the Carolingians for fighting the Saxons, and then the Carolingians conquered Saxony, and then therefore start fighting against the Slavs themselves. There were the Scandinavians. This fear of the Eastern Frankish kingdom brought the Denmark to kind of strengthen to as a monarchy, to Christianize, also because it was wealthier, telling the truth. And to eventually participate to the Northern Crusades, like the Danish had their own strongholds in Estonia and in other areas. They had this kind of shared. What I would like to make you more understand about the Crusades is that they were kind of participated, right? That there were a lot of, the stronger the better. Like, if you found a lot of people going on a campaign that you expect to be successful, you go there with them too. This was the spirit of chivalry at the time. You were a errant knight, you had everything to prove, and you fought and died, and hopefully not died, but that was the lifestyle of a knight. And in the meanwhile, you would promote yourself in front of the local rulers, maybe making a successful marriage with a rich widow, let's say, getting a fief, settling down, kind of passing your title to your descendants. So it was a great enterprise, and this was not just a matter of elites. This was a commercial business, right? The Hanseatic League here founded, in fact, Lübeck was refounded by the Duke of Saxony, Henry the Lion, who in fact fought against the Slavs. Lübeck was, as you know, it was the most important and the founder, the most important city of the Hanseatic League, and it was built over the ruins of a Slavic settlement had gone destroyed among the war with the Slavs, and this place is refounded, becomes a commercial power. And the Hanseatic League spreads far into these other surrounding cities. We think about Hamburg, we think about Bremen, Stralsund, etc. And it starts becoming even more powerful than entire kingdoms, like the one of Denmark. They dictate who can buy what. They're, to the Kingdom of England. They have this control of these traffics on the Baltic, in the North Sea. And they contribute logistically to the enterprise, just like the Italians contributed in the same way to the colonization of the Near East by the Crusaders. The Germans do the same in the Baltic to this their own elites, and in fact they even sent out the Italians, because the Italians had this enormous capacity of commercial penetration. They were starting to appear even in Germany, in the Baltic, when the traffics had started becoming very, very, very interesting. So the Germans kind of keep them out because they feared that they would monopolize that too. So this produces a lot of organization of matters, of administration as well, and it makes these areas grow, right? Urbanization. Cities are founded, right? These places hadn't known cities. They were just kind of towns, town forts, chiefly for trade and defense. But here, the Christianization also involves the diocesan model, and therefore the construction of buildings, of city walls, of something that has an imposing structure that, as in those regions, had, at least up to that point, had never been seen, right? With villages and towns and this kind of fortified rings, but not much more than that. And much of this expansion actually occurred thanks to the same trade with these peoples. Like, as always, it's not that these people were standardly enemy. All of these populations fought but up to a certain point, but war is not infinite. You need resources, so when you make peace and you start trading once again, right? There's also this myth that these were kind of, they wanted to tear each other apart, right? Yeah, in part, yes, but it's not because they were like one from one side and one from the opposite one. It was all mixed. It was all extremely complicated, and everybody distrusted the others. Like, even the same, I don't know, there was a lot of competition within the same knights, within the same lords. Nobody quite liked each other, right? So it was normal to employ, I don't know, pagan mercenaries as well. Why not? That's why I insisted so much on the thing of not translating this period into something like it was all about religion, right? They were killing each other because of religion. No, it wasn't like that. It was not like that, right? These people wanted to make a freaking lot of money, and they did it, right? And that's a more than good reason. Then you can clothe with everything, with the excuse that, yeah, these were pagans, etc. But we have already said it. Sometimes being Christian wouldn't even spare you from being massacred. Because guess why? Everybody does that. Nobody cares. Nobody cares. If I can steal your stuff and nobody punishes me, I will do it, right? That was what the law was like there. Especially in this frontier, because this was really a frontier, so it was dangerous and dramatic, as you can imagine. By the way, this Baltic territory was a nightmare, was a hellish place. Like, it was some of the most depressed areas of Europe. It was cold, covered in forests and in marshes. You could, if you got inland, you could as well remain cut out from communication when, the ice melted. Everything could turn into a muddy extent. The armies would be even trapped into, and they would starve to death or fall into swamps, etc. This stuff did happen. That's also why this expansion didn't take much space inland, right? It was mostly a coastal expansion where the major cities could be also resupplied by sea, because entering to the hinterland was objectively stupid. Like, it was populated by people who were extremely violent, adverse, who would have taken like massive amount of resources, many more than the ones that, outstanding ones that were actually invested into this whole business, right? All that was important to do was controlling the main trade stops, like on the coast, at river estuaries, river mouths, and for exporting stuff that came through these rivers, even from far away. There were also kind of already evolved, for example, Russia itself had, especially Novgorod in the north, but still at this point Kiev in the south, and other centers are along the great Russian rivers of florid trade. They were great trade centers under Varangian time, and this came to an end with the Mongol invasion in the 13th century, because these areas eventually would even meet, as you know, the onslaught of the Mongol invasion. I mean, the Mongols arrived at the gates of Germany. They even crossed the Alps into Italy. I mean, it was a pretty messed up thing that, in fact, was it stopped itself, to tell the truth. The gates of this very Frankish world that we have highlighted it, but its outskirts in the west were invested and brutally by this, and they changed all the economical geography of the area, because Russia would never be the same in terms of trade dynamics and urban development, etc. It would change really a lot, right? But this thing is mostly coastal, it's mostly even maritime, right? The Hanseatic League here is the key, because that kept together all this major traffics, and their activity was controlled by this by the political and military elites of the Teutonic Order chiefly, and that had a very clever administration and government and was very thorough and thoughtful. And so in all this picture, though, the major ideology, let's say, surrounding the justification of this big movement was religious, right? And why? Well, essentially because the whole world was religious, as we've seen at the time, but also because it was led by the above, right? This is a moment between the First and the Second Crusade into which the reforming papacy has an enormous power, right? From the second half of the 12th century, won't be quite like that anymore. In the 13th century, even less, right? Especially this, this first wave of the Baltic Crusades is directed closely by Rome, right? Rome has a direct overview of this all. It's given the same permission for doing it. So everything was done in the name of the church, legally. This was very important because theoretically, you could even, the ideology of just war in the early Middle Ages had been about essentially defending your own country, like killing a person independently from whether this person was a pagan or not was a sin. It was recognized as a sin. And ideally, the Christians would have just to defend. Here, the situation was very different because the Christians were directly on the offensive on populations that had really not done much against them. Of course, as we've seen before in the Germano-Slavic frontier, yeah, that happened because warfare had gone on for hundreds of years. But it wasn't a matter of Slavs. Some Slavs, of course, were already, Christianized, some from centuries as well. And they were also framed within the empire, the Christian empire, technically, as we have seen with the Duchy and later Kingdom of Bohemia. So also, obviously, the pagan tribes that lived beyond, like in the Baltic proper, where Christianity up to that point had not fared, or at least had not taken root, right, were violent as well. They would kill each other, slaughter each other, enslave each other, and selling their slaves to others. They would all these things, but objectively hadn't had the capacity, aside from piracy perhaps, to harass Christians in a major way, right? So more than the Christians, the empire, because objectively the Baltic Crusade is also closely followed by the emperor that technically is the universal emperor of the West, at least, but it's mostly a German ruler, so it has also a very important control on this stuff. Like, it was a very close relation between the master of the Teutonic Order and the imperial the emperors, basically, and the king of Germany, partly because they were operating into different environments, and they were kind of interested in having a point of reference from both sides, like not to be overwhelmed illegally from according to the rules of the empire, but other private powers, like it happened actually regularly in many areas of Germany, and not only. Especially in later times, up to the 13th century, the only hope, even for the Near Eastern, like the states of the military orders of Outremer, was the emperor. Like in the 13th century, the universalism reaches its apex, but it also starts crumbling as a consequence immediately afterwards, and with the rise of national monarchies, these military orders start freaking out because they perfectly know what is going to happen. Look at what the Templars would end like under Philip IV in France, and so there were broad interests, broad connections, and generally speaking, this is what you will probably hear very rarely, kind of a Sibyl idea. The fact that of this great invasion and reorganization of the territories and of the populations, etc., was aimed at the end of the day at a great improvement, right? It was not really meant in progressist terms like we would do today, but objectively, you gotta say that those areas, they lost their ancient traditions. They, in part, were massacred, in part were oppressed, and in part even enslaved. But overall, those were areas that even up to like recent times in the 19th century, 20th century, when they came back, they were still more advanced than the surroundings, right? That had remained instead kind of theoretically free in this regard. And it sounds harsh, but this is the paradox we always talk about, that civilization does pass even through these massive atrocities. And after all, there was still the possibility. It wasn't all about butchering. Like, there were peoples who were wiped out, like the Bends, like the Prussians, but also others were kind of framed within this Germanic rule without at least being wiped out. They were used, of course, like working force. They were being kind of second-class people in part, but still the whole thing worked for the evolution of these places, and you can still see it today in what is left from those times. Those even incredible architectures that you even don't really see very often in Western Europe itself. So I know it sounds controversial, and I know it is to be controversial, because otherwise it wouldn't matter, right? Instead, it happened exactly in this way, so nobody can answer to question whether it would have been better or worse if things had gone otherwise. We don't know. But we gotta admit that for 12th century standards, what was done in here was pretty amazing, right? Going back to the religious/ideological point of view, the legitimization of these campaigns was naturally in part autonomous. Like, the Pope had oversaw this stuff but kind of formalized it, gave green light for it, but still a lot was about autonomous decisions at a local level, as you can imagine, and in fact, especially the Teutonic Order would kind of evolve on its own, right? What is fascinating about the Teutonic Order is also this perspective of his that was born, as you know, in Jerusalem for assisting defending the German pilgrims, because actually all corporations, like military orders, etc., were all usually nationally based. Like, okay, there were multinational, telling you the truth. Of course, there were people from other nationalities, but think about just language. Every community had its own group, its own organization. It was normal. This happened also in universities. It happened in corporations, etc. And at one point, they they don't abandon Jerusalem, but they start seeking other places. Like, they go first in Hungary, and I think they're given a bunch of fiefs in what would be today's Romania or something like that, and where German communities were also expanding in and would remain there historically for a very long time, and eventually they get in Poland, right, into Prussia. They start building their own state there, as vassals of the King of Poland, by the way. And this speaks for me for the convenience that was seen at that point towards that theater, right? You had many options in here. You had your own houses scattered in various places in Europe. These military orders had houses scattered everywhere. like from the Ottoman states into to Germany, into, in this case, even they had seats, I don't know, into Italy, into other countries. But the fact that there was an active choice at that point of saying, okay, we will not just stay in the Near East, but we will go in the Baltic, well, it's a market option, right? And it's very important, in my opinion, as an indicator of the fact that of all of the crusades, these ones were in the north were kind of the most profitable. Paradox, which is strange because technically those were lands that were in fact more primitive. They were more kind of backwards, right? The Near East was very developed. Spain was very developed. The Muslim areas were rich, etc. But still, there were so many political interests and overcrowding, let's say, in those places that made the whole thing slow down and being more controversial. Take the Iberian powers. After they win at Las Navas, they stop basically that they had basically the whole Iberian Peninsula in their hands, but the Arabs, the Muslims, keep staying there in southern Spain for like 200 years because at that point it hadn't become important to finish, expelling the Muslims from there, but like fighting against the neighboring Christians, right? And that was pretty messed up. If you take at least religion as a standard, that, as we have seen, is not actually the pillar on which this whole thing rests, but mostly about other political and social issues. The Near East is a failure, right? The beginning is an overwhelming success. Like the First Crusade is probably one of the most successful military operations of the whole Middle Ages, and very overlooked into this, and kind of sucked how Western historiography said, the Crusades served to nothing, they didn't have to go there. Well, this is false. I personally believe, of course, it was a failure, because eventually they screwed up. They lost everything in the 13th century with the fall of Acre in 1291, what was 91, 93, 91, I think. And they, in perspective and insight, you say, maybe it was better not to do that, but actually, they messed up. By 1099, with the conquest of Jerusalem, what the Crusaders had seized was enough theoretically for further expansion. Then eventually they ruined it by themselves. But actually, the Crusades in the Near East could start a much greater expansion. Like up to the 13th century was still feasible. Like look at what the expeditions that the French mounted up in the Crusade in Egypt. Like those were some of the largest armies ever collected. Like at the end, it was aborted because Louis IX died. The plague broke out there, but that expedition was very likely to reconquer Egypt. Therefore, to take out the major opponent to the Crusader rule in Jerusalem, and it shows an enormous strategical depth and capability of what the West had come to arrive. So the Baltic probably was appealable, was kind of more enticing for the Germans proper. Like the Germans objectively lived next door, so they had it easier. Also in terms of jurisdiction, like a French knight would have less interest to go to, to Livonia than going to the Near East, where there were other largely French crusades, and everything was like, especially with the fall of Constantinople, the creation of also later on of an Angevin empire. The French power had taken a kind of Mediterranean dimension. For the Germans, objectively, it was better to go in the east, even though, of course, like crusaders were coming from everywhere in part, right? But there is objectively in the northeast this more German prevalence, which is obvious, right? So what I find very interesting about the ideological side of the story is how identical the picture of the Northeast was, like in terms of justification of this all and ideal modalities to the Near Eastern Crusades, because the conquest of Jerusalem that immediately was used in the propaganda of the Northern Crusades, like the model to be inspired by. In Latin, they said to the Crusaders, sicut Galli ad liberationem Jerusalem vos preparate, which means, just like the French, right, prepare yourself to the freedom of Jerusalem, right? This was the same exact thing that the German Crusaders were told while they were going into the Near East, in the northeast of Europe, in the Baltic. That is, just do what the French have done by seizing Jerusalem. So the capture of Jerusalem, I mean, Jerusalem for a Christian was literally the single most important city in the world, right? Even if everybody cared, obviously, and unavoidably about Rome more, because pilgrims who traveled up to Jerusalem usually passed through Rome, and from their accounts they wrote as a regular base much more about Rome. They found much more amazing than about Jerusalem, and surely there are its reasons for this from a Western perspective. But the concept is that Jerusalem is the center of the world, right? It's a place from which all the three continents depart, ideally, in the medieval globes, and it's a word that permeates the whole spirituality of the Christian at this point. So every place on earth theoretically should be like Jerusalem. The monasteries scattered all over the Christian world at this point, the monastery is the copy of the heavenly Jerusalem, what it should be like. So there is nothing surprising in hearing this German Crusaders thinking at this, almost devilish places, like forgotten by God apparently, in this wilderness of the northeast, like Jerusalem. But so it was, because it was a spiritual journey, right? It's an armed pilgrimage. Always remember, crusades, the best definition for a crusade is armed pilgrimage. It's not properly a war, right? At least it is de facto, but in those time standards, what is a crusade? By the way, at this time, the crusade term didn't even exist. Telling you, the term crusades appears for the first time in the 13th century. Just for saying why shouldn't be so dogmatic about anything. The concept, though, is that there was something more about it. Like, theoretically, there were certain pretexts that we don't know whether they were fabricated or that they were, however, overly emphasized, but basically in certain contexts in this Near Eastern region, northeastern Baltic areas, in part Christianism had spread, in part, but some of them were very close. Like, if we talk about the Wends, they would be like in today's northern Poland, like they wouldn't be that far away. So these were areas that obviously had known Christianity, had known Christian missionaries. Some people would be obviously, of course, already Christian. The Christianization of the Northeast didn't pass largely through swords, right? They passed through, free conversion, right? In these cases, though, there was a resistance from certain tribes, certain polities that had refused to enter the control of this, of the Germanic Empire, of these military orders that were sent there, and they started reacting to Christianization as a symbol of that invasion, because that was it technically was, right? The idols, the pagan idols, and the symbolism and spirituality was paraded as a banner of these people's freedom, of course, because that's what symbols are, right? And this is what these operations were. They were invasions. It's as if, you wake up one day and you find someone invading your house, your land, and saying, here I rule. And then you start fighting for what you believe in, and that incidentally is what these people do not believe in, and so you despise them, and you think they are, in fact, different and weird, and you kind of start emphasizing the fact that you are different, even on a religious base. And we have the Bishop of Magdeburg, in fact, stating that some pagans had revolted essentially and had started destroying the Christian symbols and churches, etc., by shouting triumphantly victory for their god Pripagal, right? That was seemingly a solar deity of the many that, of course, populated we can't say the pantheon, but at least the spirituality of these peoples, and that had become, in fact, the symbol of their resistance against these Christian invasions. And this is very interesting because it shows that this was a kind of a casus belli, right? Here, the literal words were "Victus est Christus, vicit Pripegala victoriosissimus," right? So these was the Bishop of Magdeburg saying to the Crusaders, this is what the pagans say, that Christ has been defeated. Long live the most victorious Pripagal, right? This was a big deal because, of course, Christ was symbolically what all these Crusaders fought and lived for, and what also presented the justification for a war in a moment in which, in fact, the ideology of just war was shifting, right? In the early Middle Ages, the more, this is kind of a difficult thing. We made a video about this stuff, but it was mostly about the early Middle Ages. Well, I said it was all an evolution on the theory of just war in the Christian world, and that naturally changed a lot, as you can imagine, with the reforming papacy, and when the Crusades were being started. Like, the reforming papacy had effectively started the Crusades, right? And this is not to be overlooked as a major phenomenon, because before that it was unknown in the whole Christian world that a bishop could launch a war, right? Even if bishops fought regularly at the time, because they were noblemen like all the others, the reforming papacy now was seizing, was taking an extra step, that basically claiming let's say the control, at least, on political and military actions. What all the struggle for investitures was for is that the papacy had started saying that its own authority was superior to the one of the emperor, also in secular matters. So this was a great opportunity, telling the truth, because it was also very political within the same German Empire, within the same Holy Roman Empire, because a lot of Germans and Italians, etc., were now deeply split between the pro-imperial and pro-papal party, right? And in fact, obeying to the papacy meant also to side more directly against the emperor, right? Or at least it was seen as an opportunity to bait the Pope in order to do things that were against the emperor. Like, if the emperor was excommunicated, for example, he said, oh, well, the Pope excommunicated him, so I am a Christian, and therefore I can now fight against this guy, because he doesn't represent anymore, and on the contrary, is enemy of the church, because has disobeyed the Pope. Well, the same thing starts being done against these pagan peoples, for the prevarications that were accused of. And the reforming papacy has a more totalizing view of the issue. Like, this is not just like deciding what the single expedition should be about, whether it's right or not to launch it. This is a sublimation of papal authority in every field. Like, the whole world should become Christian, even with force if it's necessary, right? And naturally, this is the ideology. The reality translated itself into, in fact, giving green light to these German elites that already by themselves wanted to expand into the Baltic, because they already knew it, because they already had ties, contacts, interests, nets, etc. in there. And it was just a way to extend papal authority in two lands that were far away. The popes had controlled even, I don't know, since a very early age, the 6th century, the evangelization of the Anglo-Saxons. I mean, the Rome had, in this sense, an enormous organizational capability, given that it wasn't properly, not even the papacy had some land and power, military, but, it was also pretty modest on its own regard. It was not a kingdom on its own. So this was a political and spiritual play, right, that more than looking at the pagans like the enemy, but was really competing for the top, for the hierarchy within the same Christian world, right? Because butchering people was kind of mainstream, even within Christians at this point, because wars were everywhere. And you can imagine people that were not even Christian and were living in these lands out there without any, hope even of... They didn't even write, right? They didn't even left... It was that easy to take a sword, to mount up an expedition, and to go seize those lands, right? I remember that these areas were kind of it was mostly about trade. These were lands located into the northeast Baltic axis in the west-east Baltic axis and the north-south in fact, Russian River axis, right? So that was the real value. It was mostly about trade, about, amber trade had been always a thing in there. There was a lot of, timber, furs, stuff like that. Those were things were needed at the time, even just for fueling the same expansion. And in fact, what was mounted up at this time was enormous from a logistical point of view. The sheer amount. Think about all these cities that were built, castles, fortifications. Well, it was an enormous work. It was a pretty damn hard work. The expansion of a Frankish world was done with a lot of working and agricultural tools in hands. It was just about the sword. It was about transforming to arable land, lots of land. It was about reclamation. It was about deforestation. It was an enormous work, enormous, for a world in which, energy costed a lot as well. So this shows you also how many resources for those time standards the West had to invest at the point that they needed, by the way, to expand. Because this wasn't just about greed that always motivates us in a way or another. This is also about the fact that certain lands are not enough for everyone. That you really need to go out there, find new space for having a better life, if anything, and then you put at that point at risk your own life, right? And starting a journey that is very difficult, right? It's not easy, but that can give you something better than maybe the miserable life than you lived at home. And this is how the face of large areas of Europe objectively changed, even ethnically, as we've seen, linguistically. And it proved that, especially these areas of the world that kind of lagged behind, like even Germany. Like Germany, in terms of the Frankish world, was basically the poorest area out there. Like 12th century Germany, you don't have to think it was particularly different from, 6th century Germany. Like it was still wild. It was still dominated by this world, the forest of the darkness. Look at its art. Look at its beautiful land in this sense, beautiful history. But still, this was not France. This was not Italy. Even parts of this was a land that still had to expand, to translate its potential into action. The 12th century is a real turning point, right? And think about in the second half of Frederick Barbarossa that imports French feudalism proper into this German land that had remained still at the vassalic beneficiary system. It was still divided in the so-called ethnic duchies that didn't have quite much to do with each other, aside from this broader maybe linguistical, awareness and identity, but they had, it was still a land to expand and to grow, right? And Germany, objectively, between the 12th and the 13th century, made an astonishing leap forward, also because it managed to expand its control over these other areas, but proving that it had kind of the resources on its own. So as we've seen now, these wars against the Slavs, it was there was a sort of pagan revival as a counter-reaction to this, expansion, right? The revival in already partly Christianized areas of ancient cults and beliefs belonging to the so-called pagan past. Of course, pagan is a Christian name, just like polytheist. A polytheistic person doesn't believe it's polytheistic because, at least today we do know that, because but just know that polytheistic is a word that makes sense just in a theistic context, just like atheist makes sense only if you consider theism, which is part of its etymology, really, right? So you can imagine all the reasons that would push these people to exist. So this was brutal. Like, this is objectively one of the most brutal chapters in medieval history, in part, and brutality requires, however, force, and this force was called into the Slavic lands through the intervention of those Saxones, Franci, Lotharingi, Flandrigene, famosissimi et domitores mundi. This was the name, right? Which means the Saxons, the Franks, the Lotharingians, the Flemish, that are most famous and tamers of the world, right? Because there was this stereotype at the time, that basically the Saxons, the Franks, all these, even the Lotharingians and the Flemish, were famous because of their military prowess in some ways, right? There was this stereotype, like, it was a real thing. Actually, it survives partly still today, and in relation to this kind of more military, this culture that is apparently more warlike in this time in history of the Middle Ages, because, and there is a reason, objectively, and the reason is in part that Germany as such doesn't really have a frontier. Let's be honest. Like, France is kind of, well isolated and surrounded by civilized peoples. Italy is well outlined. There are the Alps. There is a certain environment, and it's connected to also kind of, civilized areas. You take Germany, that already by itself in Central Europe at this point is not much of a evolved, developed place as we've seen before, and that is to which there is basically, especially in the East proper, and this is the key of the interpretation, there is no border. Like, this is very important. Never underevaluate the molding of a culture in a context where you have an open frontier. That develops militarization. The fact that there are poor local resources also increases the necessity of taking arms to go seizing other ones and to defending others, because there is more hunger. People are more willing to kill each other for that. And as we've seen, the Slavs were pretty turmoilous on their own. Even this Slavic Christian monarchies had been developing. They were starting to be, they were tough, they were kind of dangerous on their own. There were wars going on. It was a pretty unstable situation. This increases militarization. So, according to the classical myth of the Germans, they were tall and big and warlike. They conquered, etc. They were bloodthirsty and all, combined to these military traditions that objectively had remained in this more militarized context. These peoples were seen as, the youth of their, especially being as sent to fight. There's plenty of literature from those times that stresses this. There is I don't remember. I remember one that was talking about all these crusaders, and then there was listing all the kind of the national cliche about them. But Germany was famous. The French knew the German swords, for example, with 1.5 swords that were seen even the Battle of Civitate, etc., were similarly used by the Germans because they were, in part, they were maybe a bit larger, but that's not a real reason. Mostly because the Germany covered in forests and swamps, and so knights dismounted more often. So you can use a 1.5 sword, like both, like preferably on foot but also on horseback, while you can't a double-handed one. But this grande épée d'Allemagne, as they were called, great swords of Germany, were kind of stereotypical, right? It's like today's Conan the Barbarian, like this Schwarzenegger, what the concept was already at the time in part. So these guys were seen as tough, resilient, brutal, and were sent to fight out there. And this is what the Europeans actually had done, always with the most violent elements of their own societies, right? All these crusaders, etc., were people who in their homeland would have caused more trouble, especially as young errant knights, than else. So they were sent either into Spain, into the Near East, into the Baltic, right? And since in the Baltic, as we've seen, the Germans were a bit the protagonists, there was all this cliche reinforce of this Germanic elements going to fight against the pagans, and of course, like in all crusades, these warriors were promised through the war for Christ the salvation of their souls, and as well, and probably not less important, much more concretely, if they had wanted optimum terram ad inhabitandum acquirere, which means that they would have received, they had wanted, right, most good land to live into, right, and this was the reason. This was really a colonization, right? There were people sent there. It was a demographic thing. Historically speaking, there are certain colonizations that do not entail really a demographic character. Like, I don't know, let's take the Phoenician in the ancient world, the Phoenician colonialism with Hellenic colonialism. Phoenician colonialism was mostly about trade centers. Phoenicians didn't go live in their colonies most of the time, Carthage being the exception, and in fact starts building emporia everywhere, but not sending people to live there too. So the Greeks sent people to live, entire communities, because there is not much of a space for everybody, and you need entire parts of the population to go out living there. And but these are not the only countries, the peoples that did this, historically speaking. Yet it's important to observe this side of colonization. Even if you take the Viking world, much of that was also in part attributable to demographic needs, as far as we know, because Vikings didn't just go pillage and raid and whatever. They also settled down, and they started inhabiting areas in kind of, also in Northern Europe, given the demographic density, it doesn't take much to alter sensibly the ethnic tissue of the local population, right? And think about how these elements made a difference in language and culture, etc. So this northern world was a bit more characterized by this phenomena, exactly because it was usually there wasn't much land, objectively, much good land to live in, right? What good land is there in Scandinavia, objectively? That sucked. You would leave there for medieval standards to go find something better, somewhere else. Well, Germany was a bit like that this time. It was a kind of a gloomy hell. And of course, maybe the Baltic Sea wasn't that better, but at least, it had the sea in some areas, and you could objectively trade. And the Baltic had its own circle, it's a bit the Mediterranean of the north, conceptually. There are lots of peoples around, and there are, resources and trade, and there is an expansion. There is some kinetic energy, and you can exploit that. You can make money from that. And that's what they do. And they civilize this land. So that today, also thanks to these peoples, those are kind of maybe not particularly the Baltic in itself, but the Baltic meant I don't know, Scandinavia or northern Germany. So these are kind of well off areas. It started back then. You have to think that certain areas of Scandinavia, even Germany, had never seen such an economical revival. Like these areas were, in fact, some had been up to that point some of the most depressed of Europe, and they make this enormous leap forward on the basis of the Frankish model, and of also the expansion of the ecclesiastical structure, right? That has an economical importance because, think about what building a diocese with a city, with a cathedral, with a scriptorium, with a market, with literate people. This creates an enormous spin-off for the development of these areas. I mean, there is a vivacity in this context that is extraordinary. Considering especially what these lands had been before, right? Of course, they would remain kind of backwards for some century again, but in the meanwhile, they would keep growing, right? And they would keep structuring even what would be achieved later on. And this shouldn't be forgotten. So the call for the mobilization against the Slavs was therefore modeled on a scheme, let's say, that was pretty well consolidated. For one side, there is the religious mission, right? So you have to send missionaries in these places, start building churches, teaching the locals about Christianity, and developing this net that we have just described. There are political military traditions of domination, for which, you can create a new space to rule and to control and to expand further. It's not a few. And of course, advantageous economical perspectives. Trade and seizing resources, exporting them, and treasuring them, etc. And these three elements cannot be separated in any way. You can't conceive in this Northern Crusades context anything but religious missions, political, military dominations, and economical advantages, but together, right? So the Germanic expansion towards the European East happened in multiple directions, and with different consistency and results, right? From the lands beyond the Elbe and the Saale up to Estonia, from the southeastern Danubian and Alpine territories to Bohemia and Poland. So this would go as far as, of course, Romania and Crimea, and the modality of actuation of this expansion are as articulated as such, right? From one side, there is of course the military conquest that is kind of the one that attracts the most our attention, and these weren't all crusades, though, and this is also an important perspective I didn't stress before. Like, this expansion also largely functioned by itself. This wasn't like, okay, we have to conquer even a small village, that's a crusade, let's destroy it because they're packed. No, it didn't quite work like that. Only sometimes we can talk about actual and proper crusade. In particular, there is the most violent one against the Wends, for example, that is contemporary to the Second Crusade in the Holy Land, by the way. But at the same time, entire peoples, of course, were wiped out. I remember this. But at the same time, there is more, as we've seen. Tillage, for example, the transformation of vast areas into arable land, the creation of new towns, and framed as centers of actual urban and territorial planning, right? There was a science behind this stuff. You see historians who study settlements, they tell you that there was a iron logic behind settlements and certain choices, and this all, of course, influenced politics and even military, and that's why maybe certain communities still have still descendants today and others don't, because they were massacred till the last one, maybe just because of this specific reason. As sad as it can sound, but history does happen like that. And of course, the foundation of markets and city centers actively inserted into the international trade, right? International trade also here is another key word. As we've said before, the Baltic was maybe not very attractive in itself, but it was a crossroad of many trade routes, right? So, and we shouldn't be surprised by the fact that naturally this expansion goes in parallel also with the trade expansion, because people were starting to travel. I mean, this had to travel more, at least, because of course these lands were always crossed, were always inhabited, were always thriving, right? In ancient times there are certain areas of today's Finland or Estonia, etc., that were actually even more advanced than certain cultures that, even more than Germany at that point, like, because of the Amber Road was a real thing, from Finland, Russia, to northeastern Italy. There is all this road that connected all these eastern and central European countries that was very trafficked at that time. So in the 12th century, of course, coordinates had changed a little bit, but this was a continent was awakening, and this context also intensified the need of controlling trade and controlling resources, and that's why the settlement occurred into these areas, and where you find the reason for them, right? And you would say, well, it's just trade, it's just economics. Well, no, it's also politics, it's also society, as we've seen. But the commercial character of this expansion is very strong, or at least it's backed by lots of, of course, this started, you can't say this started chiefly from military reasons or political reasons. They were coming all together, but what you see is that these crusades were regularly accompanied by merchants, by workers, by colonists, by traders, and that they were the backbone, the fuel of this expansion. So you understand a lot from there too, and that's why new cities were founded, where commoners would go live in. This was a chance, even escaping, as we've seen before, grim conditions, even of individual subservience to local laws, like starting a new living with certain advantageous canons that, especially in the Teutonic Order, they, that there was a lot of competition in feudal Europe for having the most advantageous canons for attracting free colonists working your land. Was a big deal. And think that these are areas, as we were seeing before, that had never known this before. Like this Germanization takes place in enormous spaces that roughly comprehend are comprehended within the ancient Carolingian borders, that is the Elbe basically, and the Danubian area,
and the territories of the Russian principalities, right? There is a moment in which, of course, the Teutonic order clashes even with Novgorod, as we know. In a particularly dramatic moment, by the way, in which the Mongols had already wiped out the greatest part of Russia, and the battle of Papus Lake, etc. We haven't still talked much in our military historical videos about those contexts, but those are beautiful, like fascinating. And watch Eisenstein's movie, even if it's anachronistic, it's a masterpiece of cinema. These are, in fact, events that changed a lot in the Western world. Even certain symbolisms, of course, were reinterpreted chiefly also later on during the 19th century by nationalism, by romanticism, but objectively they were important because they brought Europeans being closer together, also to fight and to kill and to slaughter. Don't think that this is not the point as well. But it started, war is the greatest potential destructor of cultures, but also its most powerful hybridator, one of its most powerful hybridators as well, right? And so this is a world that at this point met the other so violently. But think of what, I don't know, this Baltic area would be in the 17th century, in the 18th century, how thriving, how dynamic, right? And how even similar in part, right? Even if there are different cultures that face the sea, but they still have something in common today. And they do feel themselves as part of that legacy. And therefore, these are very important landmarks. Let's say in history, we can say something like that. There is another element, another bipartition, if you want, that we have hinted at before, which is the essential, cooperation in part, but also competition between this German, meant as properly the Kingdom of Germany and the Holy Roman Empire, and the Danish ambitions, right? Denmark, as we've said, also seen many times in Schwerpunkt, was this, among the so-called Scandinavian monarchies, albeit it's in the Jutland, but Sweden, Norway, and Denmark are put together, was the most advanced one. As you know, it was, first of all, closer to civilization, warmer, kind of a flatland, well connected between two seas. It developed faster, right? Even its own geography probably required greater organization, because it was kind of an easier country to invade. In practice, Denmark converted to Christianity also largely for fear of a German invasion at the time of the Teutonians. It was it developed further, right? They weren't particularly strong monarchies, but they were something, especially considering that the north of Germany wasn't a power on its own. Like, the same reason why the Hanseatic Leagues evolved is that the German kingdom was pretty messed up, was fragmented, and the major center of power was the Rhineland and the south, like of Swabia and Bavaria, right? And this northeastern area of Germany was pretty fragmented. Therefore, the royal authority was fairly far away. The Duchy of Saxony would remain like a point of reference, but it wasn't also in there much of a deal after all. That's the reason why the Hanseatic League spread, because from one side in the south you have this weak German monarchy, you have in the north this weak Scandinavian monarchies, so you have space. In fact, I don't know, the Hanseatic League went as far as setting on fire Copenhagen, for example. They were a power on their own. Sometimes not even a kingdom like Denmark could stand. So there was this attrition, as you understand, because the Danish wanted their own space in the Baltic as well. And this developed, of course, contacts, maritime activity, both in trade and in war, and this Danish ambitions were manifested with a certain vivacity, especially starting from the mid-12th century up to the 20s of the 13th. And also in here it involved lay lords, bishops, Cistercian monks, and Premonstratensian monks as well. Colonists that from Denmark itself were recruited from the German and Flemish world, interestingly enough, which tells you, by the way, how certain areas of Germany were kind of polarized more towards Denmark in the sense. I mean, in terms of the local population, they prefer to go on under their own guidance than someone else's in certain cases. And naturally, many other commoners, bourgeois, merchants, etc. And these, of course, we can't say the exact same thing for the German powers, for the Teutonic Order. They use these elements them all, right? But just for saying that, even this was a channel for something else. Like, for example, Flanders was at this time fundamentally autonomous from the reach of the German Emperor, and yet these colonists wanted eventually to go from Flanders. It wasn't objectively, Flanders was well developed at this point. They would invest their life, their future into the Baltic, in the Baltic Crusade, because they thought that there they would have a better living. Right? Of course, there were certain areas that were kind of poor as well. You take Frisia, if you take, certain areas of Westphalia, etc. These were largely also kind of desperate masses of people that wanted to have a better life than the places in which they lived. But what is important is that the the Baltic environment in this context attracted people from very far away, right? That apparently wouldn't have had any commitment into it. Instead, they saw it as an opportunity. And it's especially commoners and merchants that represent, perhaps, the medium for a further expansion towards the northeastern regions. When, for example, the Augustinian Meinhard decided to travel during the 80s of the 12th century to the land of the Livonians, pro Christo et predicandi tantum causa, that is, for Christ and to make proselytism about his cause. He arrived with a company of Teutonici mercatores, right? So, Teutonic German merchants, right? That through the Dvina River frequently penetrated in the internal regions for their own trade. And the merchants that operated in the Baltic Sea acted jointly with the famous knightly monks of the Teutonic Order when this before I said that they were in Jerusalem as well, but they were born in Acre, actually, on the model of the Templars and the Hospitallers at the time of the Third Crusade, was committed into the conquest of Livonia and of Prussia, being sided and eventually substituting to the initiatives of the lay princes, also of the ecclesiastic princes, of course, and of another religious military order, the one of the Brothers of the Sword, that eventually in 1238 would merge into the Teutonic Order themselves. So the story of the Teutonic Order is wholly another one, and if you go to see that video we were talking about before, that should be Ostsiedlung and Teutonic Prussia or something like that. You can find something more about it, but we will have to talk about it more. Which Schwerpunkt now we're still filling the gaps of all this net, but there is still a lot to talk about in kind of moralistic terms. But we can't start dipping into certain aspects already, and I don't know when this will happen, but we'll see about it. But we also spoke about the Teutonic Order before, and we have highlighted which characteristics it had, why it was so successful, why it represents a point of reference even for the emperor, for many powers were gravitating around it. And of course it would clash as well with this major, famously with Poland, with Lithuania as well, up to the great battle of Tannenberg, Grunwald, if you prefer. But for here, I think we can conclude by adding maybe another final consideration that, however, is very, very important. So, about this northeastern crusades. In the 12th century, the great crusader utopia in the Near East demonstrates its own fragility, or, however, maybe better, its character that is all internal to a Western world that is yet to learn how to actually sustain certain colonial adventures in areas that are not territorially contiguous to them, right? You can see instead in the Iberian Peninsula that I made a video about the Spanish Reconquista, the Iberian Reconquista. You can search in medieval Iberia playlist if you're interested, but also in the Slavic lands of the Baltic, right? So the foundation of the basis for a further and decisive conquest in the following centuries, right? The religious ideal enters locally in conjunction with the interests of the political and economical forces that are tied in various measures to the papacy. Never forget this, but they're also capable of autonomously realizing its own ends, right? They, whether we're talking of the great or small military aristocracies, or the mercantile classes, or even the monastic chivalric orders, they know how to create a system that is able to consolidate, to replicate itself, to expand, and to remain there for quite a long time, right? And its legacy would be collected, in fact, as you know, later on by Brandenburg, by, let's say, powers that will, still essentially benefit from the achievements that, had been started in the Middle Ages, many centuries later into the modern age, right? Proving, therefore, that this model was, in a certain sense, quite ahead for its time, right? This was not fully achieved in the Outremer states, not even in terms of modalities, in part because naturally, the Baltic lands were kind of easier to reshape from the root, right? At the root, like there were simpler societies, they were not so structured, and also culturally not necessarily resistant, a bit. I mean, it's obvious that the Near East was something slightly different, it was somewhat different from the West. The Baltic world was different from the West in a measure, of course, in how we have defined the West, in Frankish and Catholic terms, essentially. But at the same time, it was weaker in terms of local resistance, right? It took time to expand, but in those areas where it could be, better controlled, it was fairly easy to remodel and to frame it under the control of this foreign elites, right? And it's a kind of a dark story. I don't want to, when I talk about this Ostsiedlung, etc., I don't want to picture this as a, as a positive, like, I actually can't even frame it as a positive, overall positive event. Like, it was a brutal acceleration of a process that would have taken place anyway, right? It's like, it's difficult sometimes to explain how this, but it's realizing that this became a chunk of the West. Like, if you compared this with Russia, I don't know, that, had still, that still took another path, right? Here, even Catholicism is important. It's not a matter just of Frankish power, but it's really being framed into a net of something greater that already works pretty well. The Byzantine Empire didn't have this broader connection capabilities. They had it kind of easy with Russia because most of the Russians were favorably exposed to that. There was a necessary connection between Constantinople and the Black Sea, what would be today's Ukraine. But it's not that Orthodoxy at this point won much else outside of that context, and also the Orthodox powers like Bulgaria or Serbia, etc., they kind of started behaving stuff on their own. Like they started being very competitive with Constantinople as well. In the Roman Christianity, you don't have that. The Catholics are, aside from of course the great problems of the 15th and the 16th century, the Reformation, etc., but up to the end of the Middle Ages, in fact, the Roman Church is objectively recognized all over, and also largely because it's not an empire on its own. Like, it's a fundamentally a central Italian principality. It doesn't have much of a larger ambition from a military point of view, unlike the Byzantine Empire that is massive. But from a political point of view, from a religious point of view, like, the achievements are incredible. They brought all of these lands within the Western sphere, the Western orbit, and they would never, they would never lose it back. And this is very important, right? And there would be some else to add, meaning that, of course, even, what was said in the Middle Ages from the Orthodox side in terms of spread of Orthodoxy remains still today, like, geographically speaking, but at this point, like, Catholicism further expanded. The Byzantine Empire collapsed, right? The Balkans eventually were conquered by the Ottomans, and just Russia was a pole of Orthodoxy that at that point was kind of more of a, it took a lot of time before Russia set itself in motion and started to be competitive, while the West was already, like, into the Renaissance, essentially. So it's very difficult to draw sharp judgment about these issues, but it's still meaningful to frame them, in my opinion, into a broader picture, into a frame that makes sense, so that when we think about the Baltic Crusades, we don't think just about the massacres. We don't think just about the religious issue. We think about all the force of a civilization that imposed itself on others, but also absorbed them into something that was to develop towards something kind of more. I was about to say either better, more consistent, but that had a future that is still our own, and therefore whichever interpretation you want to give to it, whether positive or negative, you still have to take it into account. And yes, and all right, and I realize the more I talk about this part of Europe during the Middle Ages and then the more we need to expand forcefully on it. I actually created a playlist, if you're interested, that I think a lot of people are watching, because some of the most watched videos I have here are from this playlist. Every time I draw, when I make a video about, I don't know, certain nationalities, everybody clicks on them, because there is someone, even if it's generic, it's about, I don't know, the ancient Avars or something more, but it attracts attention. I didn't know from, but here I created, I think, medieval Slavs in Eastern Europe. Yes, this is the name of the playlist, and it's consistent enough. 14 videos. This is the 15th, and we will keep expanding it, right? And this has as many videos as medieval Britain and Ireland, interestingly enough, so now it even surpasses it. But for saying it, that this area of Europe is very, very important, and we shouldn't overlook it. Like, I should find some material, something we can talk about on here to cover more that part of Europe, because it's actually very important, and a lot of things were happening there, for which, you know, great parts of the rest of Europe also fought for in the centuries, and it doesn't have to be underestimated. Alright, so always with this sense of incredible lack of completion. Like, I could talk forever about stuff, even if I don't, objectively I don't know very much. I'm not about it. I'm not an expert in it, but I realize how much, in fact, we normally neglect about this world, and how it doesn't deserve that, for sure. So we'll speak soon, hopefully, more about this. And for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like, or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.